With mods that make changes to all aspects of gameplay being as popular as always, it is no wonder that Skyrim's difficulty is a constant point of discussion. So today I want to take a look at Skyrim's way of handling difficulty, how it compares to some other games, and how it could be improved in some ways using mods. Before I begin, I want to stress that this is my opinion on difficulty, and you are free to disagree with anything I say here. Okay, so let's get to it. First, we need to figure out how difficulty is handled in Skyrim. There are two things that weigh into it: the actual difficulty settings and Skyrim's level scaling. Let's talk about the settings first. This is probably the biggest problem I have with the vanilla game, because the only thing this setting affects is how much damage you deal and how much you receive. The only balanced setting here is the adept difficulty, where the damage multiplier is 1 on both sides. On lower difficulties you will not only kill enemies much quicker, but also take a lot less damage from them. And looking at higher difficulties, this effect is reversed, making the enemies really tanky and hard to kill. The reason why I don't like this system is because of consistency. If I come up against a bandit who is wearing the same armor, uses the same weapon, and is about the same level as my character, I would expect to deal just as much damage as he does. But on any difficulty setting other than Adept, that simply isn't the case. And let me make this clear, I have no problem with human enemies tanking a lot of hits, as long as I can take the same amount. As for the other enemies in the game, like dragons, undead and so on, I think it's more reasonable for them to take and deal different amounts of damage, because for them, I don't have a frame of reference. I simply don't know how much damage they are supposed to deal when compared to my own damage. I actually prefer the damage to be fair on both sides. If the human same leveled enemy in front of me can take 5 hits, so should I. I do, however, prefer my damage to be a bit higher, so normally I won't just try to balance out the multipliers, but also raise them at the same time. This has nothing to do with realism, it's just the way I like it. A quick note on realism though, people who describe things in this game as realistic or unrealistic need to calm down a bit. You're playing a fantasy RPG for God's sake. A world where magic and dragons are a thing. And you're talking about realism? Come on. If you have certain preferences, that's fine, but don't speak about realism in this context. Moving on to the second thing that makes up Skyrim's difficulty, the level scaling. Now, this has thankfully been dialed down a bit when compared to Oblivion, so you won't run into bandits wearing Daedric armor, but it is still present. The way it works in Skyrim is that every area has a certain level range and will scale to the most appropriate level. For example, if an area is designed to be explored between level 15 and 35, and you enter at level 10, the dungeon will scale to its lowest level, which is 15 in this case. However, this area is then locked to that level, so if you decide to retreat and come back later, it will still be that level, regardless of your new level. In addition, there are also certain enemies that won't scale at all. I believe the giants are probably the best example for that. They will always be at a certain level, no matter your own level. This is why every single one of us got wrecked the first time we encountered a giant in the wild. But as your character grows stronger, they will stay the same. Let me be honest, the level scaling in this game isn't actually too bad. Most times it will provide you with an adequate challenge no matter your level, but still gives you the satisfaction of blazing through a low level area once you leveled up a lot. I still don't really like it though. I prefer static level areas that give you those epic battles against way stronger enemies. This does limit the freedom of the game a bit, but I actually like being guided a little bit when it comes to exploration. And in this case it happens through the difficulty of areas you're not meant to be in yet. So, until now we have an unbalanced system on the one hand, and on the other is one that isn't so bad but could need some improvements. But how do other games tackle difficulty? Let's take a quick look at two examples. First up is The Witcher 3. This is probably the best reference when it comes to open world RPGs today. I am aware, however, that Skyrim is somewhat older than this game, but it's still interesting to look at. Just like Skyrim, The Witcher 3 offers different difficulty settings, and just as in Skyrim, these settings apply certain modifiers to enemy health and damage. It isn't a flat multiplier though. Monsters on higher difficulties will get a lot more additional health and damage than humans, meaning that humans are still fairly easy to kill, but monsters will provide a greater challenge. Also, Geralt's damage output doesn't change. In addition, higher difficulties will also reduce the amount of experience you gain, therefore you won't outlevel enemies as easily as on lower difficulties. Enemies in this game also don't scale, so if you want to go to Skellige on level 1, be prepared to get your ass handed to you. I'm still not a fan of simply cracking up values to make the game harder, but at least The Witcher 3 handles it a lot better than Skyrim does. Next up is Dark Souls 3, which I know isn't an open world RPG, but the Souls games have a reputation of being difficult, while also handling difficulty really well. So how does it work? Well, the game is pretty linear, so the simplest way in which Dark Souls 3 handles its difficulty is by giving enemies in later areas more health and make them hit harder. And if you follow the natural progression of the game and don't spend all your souls on useless items and attributes, you should be able to kill the enemies in about the same amount of hits in every area. But in sharp contrast to Skyrim, this is not what makes the game difficult. The main spike in difficulty comes in the form of more complex enemies in the later game areas. While early enemies move sluggish and are fairly predictable, late game enemies use faster and more varied attacks, making it harder to adapt. But it's a gradual process, and the game will never throw something at you that you absolutely cannot deal with at that point. This form of difficulty is of course not completely applicable when it comes to open world RPGs, but I do think that they could take some inspiration from the Souls games. These are just two examples for games that handle difficulty a bit better than Skyrim. If you can think of other games that do difficulty well, feel free to tell me. I'm really curious to see what you could come up with. But how do we actually improve Skyrim's difficulty? Well, thankfully there are a plethora of mods to fit everyone's preferences. You can mod everything from enemy behavior to damage values and even remove most of the scaling in Skyrim. I'm currently using a combination of mortal enemies, wildcat and deadly combat to adjust enemy behavior and certain game mechanics, as well as Moro loot to remove most of the scaling and a small tweak to balance the damage multipliers. For me, this gives the best balance between a good challenge and comfortable gameplay. If you have your own setups you would like to share with other people, please do so below this video. I'm curious to see how other people like to adjust their game's difficulty. But that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it at least a bit interesting, and I will see you in the next one.